The chandeliers blazed with merciless light. Thousands of crystal drops scattered the glow of 100 candles across the endless mirrors of the great hall, making Versailles shimmer like an eternal sunrise. But for all its brilliance, the Hall of Mirrors was no sanctuary. It was a theatre, and everyone inside it knew their role. The courtiers smiled with painted lips while their eyes betrayed jealousy, hunger, and malice. Laughter rose like glass about to shatter. Behind every rustle of silk, behind every bow, lay a blade waiting to be unsheathed. And then the vast golden doors creaked open. The courtiers turned as one, the air tightening. Into this gilded cage stepped a woman who had no right to be there. No right by blood, no right by name, no right by centuries of tradition. Yet she moved with the serene certainty of a queen. Her gown of pale rose satin seemed to glow beneath the chandeliers, her jewels catching the light like captive stars. She walked slowly, her heels striking the polished parquet with an echo that carried across the silence. Whispers bloomed like poison. "Not even noble," hissed one powdered marquise behind a fan. "The daughter of a financier," muttered a duke, his eyes narrowed. "A courtesan, not a lady," sneered another voice, dripping with contempt. But their words, however venomous, could not erase the truth. All eyes were on her. She did not bow her head, nor falter. She seemed carved from porcelain, fragile in form, indestructible in spirit. The glittering court, raised on bloodlines stretching back to Charlemagne, had never seen such insolence. To them she was an intruder, a bourgeois interloper come to profane Versailles. But to the man who sat upon the throne, she was destiny. Louis XV, le bien-aimé, the beloved king, or once beloved, long ago. Now he sat slouched upon the throne, his handsome face dulled by weariness, his eyes ringed with shadows. Crown and sceptre weighed heavier with each passing year. His queen, Marie Leczinska, offered him piety but no delight. France's fields groaned with famine, its coffers bled by endless wars, yet Versailles still glittered with absurd magnificence. Louis, bored of duty, hungered for something else. Laughter, pleasure, the promise of escape. And now, as he watched Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson stride into the Hall of Mirrors, he believed he saw salvation. She curtsied not too deep, not too humble, but measured with exact precision. It was not obeisance, it was a performance. Louis's lips curved almost imperceptibly, and the court shuddered with foreboding. A new star had entered their galaxy, and its brilliance threatened to eclipse them all. But this was not merely a love story. Versailles had seen countless mistresses, dazzling beauties who rose like fireworks and fell like ash. The story of Jeanne-Antoinette was different. She would not be content with the king's bed alone. She would reach further, deeper, until her hands guided the very levers of France itself. The courtiers whispered her name with a mixture of fear and fascination. Madame de Pompadour, a title purchased with wealth, wielded like a weapon. She was not born noble, but she would reign as though nobility itself bent to her will. The palace trembled, for beneath the chandeliers and mirrors lay a battlefield silent, gleaming, merciless. Every smile was a trap, every gesture a stratagem. Versailles was designed as a cage by Louis XIV, the Sun King, to imprison the nobility in rituals and splendour. Now, in the age of Louis XV, it had become something darker still, a serpent's nest, where gossip poisoned faster than daggers. And into this nest had stepped Jeanne-Antoinette, wrapped in silks, armed with wit, carrying a prophecy whispered in childhood. Long ago, a fortune-teller had looked upon the wide-eyed girl from the bourgeois streets of Paris and declared she was destined to capture the heart of the greatest man in France. Her family had laughed, then believed. They nurtured her beauty, her charm, her cleverness like rare flowers in a hothouse, until she bloomed into the woman now gliding through mirrored halls. Was it destiny or design? That question would haunt her to her grave, for as she bowed before Louis XV, Versailles itself seemed to hold its breath. The king leaned forward, his expression softening, his eyes fixed as if he saw no one else. The courtiers exchanged glances, envy burning, hatred simmering. They had seen this story before. Mistresses adored, then discarded. But something in her bearing, in the calm steel beneath her gentleness, whispered that this time would be different. This mistress would not fade. The night glittered on, the mirrors reflecting endless layers of light and shadow, until it seemed that Versailles itself was an illusion, a dream built upon gilded lies. Jeanne Antoinette smiled as she danced, her laughter like the chiming of silver bells, yet even as music swelled, the daggers of envy unsheathed themselves in silence. For behind every silk curtain of Versailles, secrets festered, jealousies plotted, betrayals brewed. Some whispered she had bewitched the king, others that she wielded charms and potions. Priests condemned her as a sinner, noblewomen despised her as an intruder, ministers cursed her as a meddler, but Louis XV did not care. He was enthralled. And so began her reign not upon a throne, but in a gilded bedchamber. Not with a crown, but with a smile. This is not simply the tale of a mistress. It is the story of how one woman bent the greatest palace in the world to her will. She became the architect of culture, the confidante of a monarch, the patroness of Enlightenment thought, and the target of a nation's rage. Versailles would glitter brighter under her touch, but beneath its golden skin the rot of decline spread, and as she ascended the court sharpened its knives, waiting for her first stumble. For Versailles remembered all too well, every star that rises must eventually fall, but in this moment, under the blaze of chandeliers, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, now Madame de Pompadour, reigned supreme. The story of Jeanne Antoinette Poisson does not begin in Versailles. It begins in the streets of Paris, muddy, noisy, alive with the cries of vendors and the clatter of carriage wheels. Far from the gilded mirrors of kings, here the air smelled of bread and smoke, of river water and refuse. It was a city where beggars starved in shadows while financiers built fortunes from paper and coin. A city of stark contrasts, where fate seemed written not by stars but by birth. And yet, even in this world of strict hierarchies, a little girl was told she would break them all. Jeanne Antoinette was born in 1721, the daughter of François Poisson, a man whose wealth was built not on blood, but on finance, a profession despised by the nobility, even as they borrowed endlessly from it. To the blue-blooded aristocracy, the Poissons were tainted by trade. But to Jeanne, Antoinette's mother, Madeleine de la Motte, this child was destined for something greater than accounts and ledgers. The legend tells us that when Jeanne Antoinette was still a little girl, her mother took her to a fortune-teller. In a dimly lit room, heavy with incense and the rustle of cards, the seer peered into the child's wide eyes and whispered words that would change everything. "You will one day be the mistress of the king." The prophecy struck like lightning. It was both absurd and intoxicating. How could this girl, delicate, with porcelain skin and bright, curious eyes, ever enter Versailles, let alone capture a monarch's heart? And yet her mother seized upon it as destiny. From that moment on, Jeanne Antoinette's life became a carefully staged performance preparing her for the role the stars had promised. She was educated not as a bourgeois girl, but as a queen in waiting. Tutors were hired to teach her music, painting, and the art of conversation. She learned to recite poetry with a voice like crystal, to dance with grace, to play the harpsichord with elegance. Most of all, she was trained in the subtle craft of charm, the ability to listen as though every word spoken to her was a revelation, the ability to speak as though her thoughts were both daring and delicate. Her family moved her within the circles of Parisian salons, where philosophers and poets gathered to debate the nature of society, faith, and desire. There, amid candlelit rooms heavy with tobacco smoke and the murmur of intellectual battle, Jeanne Antoinette learned to sharpen her wit. She was no idle beauty. She absorbed the ideas of the Enlightenment, the wit of Voltaire, the poetry of Rousseau, the cadence of words that could captivate even the most jaded ear. But outside those glittering rooms, the reality of her birth gnawed at her. The nobility mocked families like hers as parvenus upstarts who thought wealth could purchase honour. To them, a fishmonger's daughter, no matter how beautiful or clever, could never cross the threshold of Versailles. Every glance she received in Paris society carried both fascination and contempt. Yet Jeanne Antoinette did not shrink from this scorn. She seemed to feed on it, to grow stronger in the face of disdain. Each insult was a reminder that she must polish her armour of charm until it gleamed too brightly to be ignored. Her beauty blossomed with alarming swiftness. Pale skin, dark eyes, hair that caught light like spun silk. But it was not her looks alone that drew notice. It was the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, with a mixture of warmth and precision as though every word was chosen with care. Men lingered in her presence, drawn in by her laughter. Women, even those who disdained her origins, found themselves unwillingly charmed. The prophecy whispered in childhood seemed less absurd as she grew, but Versailles still loomed like a fortress of gold, impenetrable to all but the nobly born. Jeanne Antoinette knew she could not storm it by beauty alone. She would need allies, strategies, and above all, patience. Her mother arranged a marriage to Charles Guillaume Le Normand d'Étiole, a wealthy but undistinguished man. It was a union of convenience, a stepping stone rather than an end. Jeanne Antoinette, now Madame d'Étioles, set about transforming their home into a miniature Versailles. She hosted salons where philosophers and musicians gathered, filling the rooms with music and debate. Visitors whispered that she shone brighter than any duchess, that her laughter alone was worth more than the tired piety of queens. She began to attend the masked balls and hunting parties, where whispers from Versailles occasionally drifted. She positioned herself on the edges of power, always watching, always waiting. When the king's carriage passed, she made sure she was seen not too forward, but never invisible. She learned the rhythm of visibility, to appear just enough to be remembered, to vanish just enough to be desired. The courtiers of Versailles may have mocked her bourgeois blood, but they underestimated the force of prophecy, or perhaps the force of a woman determined to make prophecy real. There are stories, whispered through centuries, that she rehearsed her role before mirrors, practicing smiles, curtsies, and glances until they became weapons. That she prayed not to saints but to fate itself, asking that the promised destiny not betray her. Some said she even believed she was chosen by heaven, that her beauty and wit were divine gifts meant to lead her to the king. Was it truth or legend? In Versailles, the line between myth and reality was as blurred as candlelight on gold. But what is certain is this: Jeanne Antoinette grew into a woman who carried destiny on her shoulders like a cloak. Every gesture, every glance, every word was honed toward one goal. While other women of her station resigned themselves to wealth without honour, she dreamed of Versailles, of gilded ceilings, of endless mirrors, of a throne she would never sit upon but would, in her own way, command. In Paris, they called her the God-given gift. In her family, they whispered that the fortune teller's words had been no trick. And in Versailles, though she had not yet arrived, her shadow had already begun to fall. For across the gilded gates, a king was growing weary of his crown, weary of duty, weary of the same tired pleasures. Louis XV was searching, perhaps not even knowing for what. He longed for delight, for charm, for a voice that could pierce the monotony of his reign. And fate, or prophecy, was preparing Jeanne Antoinette Poisson to be that voice. Soon, the gilded doors of Versailles would open. Soon, she would walk into the Hall of Mirrors, not as a guest, not as a noble, but as destiny incarnate. But for now, she was still the bourgeois daughter of a financier, raised in a city that scorned her origins. A child shaped by prophecy, rehearsing for a stage brighter and more dangerous than she could yet imagine. The wheel of fortune had begun its slow, inexorable turn. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Versailles stirred to life. Dawn spilled across the gilded facade of the palace, its countless windows catching the light like the eyes of some vast, slumbering beast. The gardens stretched outward in precise geometries, fountains whispering, statues frozen in eternal allegory. To an outsider, it was paradise. To those trapped within, it was a cage gilded so brilliantly that one could mistake its bars for heaven itself. This was Versailles, the most magnificent palace in Europe, the jewel of France, and the theatre of absolute monarchy. Every inch of stone, every pane of glass, every polished mirror existed not merely for beauty but for power. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had built it as a masterpiece of control, a labyrinth where nobility were drawn close, dazzled, tamed, and bound. He had caged his rivals not with chains, but with rituals of glitter and obedience. And long after his death, the machinery still whirred. By the reign of Louis XV, Versailles was both dazzling and diseased. The palace glittered with chandeliers, with gowns shimmering in hues of sapphire, emerald, and rose. Courtiers glided across the marble floors like painted spectres, each performing their role in the endless play of deference. Yet beneath the silk and powder seethed ambition, envy, and rot. Here, gestures were weapons. A glance could ruin, a whispered phrase could elevate. To step too close to the king, unbidden, was a death sentence for one's career. To stand too far was exile into irrelevance. The courtiers mastered the art of performance, the bow that seemed humble but concealed pride, the compliment that carried venom. Versailles was a stage, and every soul within it, an actor, playing for survival. Louis XV, unlike his great-grandfather, lacked the appetite for discipline. The Sun King had demanded submission, rising each morning to the ritual of the lever, where nobles fought for the honour of handing him a sleeve or a slipper. Louis XV, weary of such pomp, often withdrew into hunting or pleasure, abandoning the theatre his ancestor had crafted. But the system endured regardless, a golden machine turning on its own momentum. Into this world, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson was preparing to enter. A bourgeois daughter, a woman whispered about in salons, she was an intruder in a play rehearsed for centuries by noble blood. Versailles was not merely a palace she had to walk into, it was a script she had to master, a drama where a single misstep could mean disgrace, ridicule, or ruin. To the nobility, Versailles was their battleground. To Jeanne Antoinette, it would be her conquest. Let us walk its corridors. The Hall of Mirrors stretched like eternity itself, chandeliers burning day and night, its vast windows. Opening onto the gardens, courtiers drifted here in constant flux, each hoping to be seen, to be remembered, to be favoured. Mirrors did not merely reflect beauty, they reflected ambition. A duchess might linger too long in admiration of her own reflection, while another woman's glance at the king's mirrored figure might ignite scandal. Every surface in Versailles was both a witness and an accomplice. Beyond lay the salon's intimate rooms where philosophy and intrigue tangled together. Here, whispered alliances were formed, lovers plotted trysts, enemies sharpened their words into invisible daggers. The salons echoed with laughter that never quite reached the eyes. A spilled glass of wine could be the birth of rumour. A smile at the wrong moment could be construed as betrayal. And above all, there was the king's bedchamber, the heart of Versailles. It was both a stage and a throne, where politics and intimacy collided. The ritual of waking and sleeping, of meals shared before watchful eyes, transformed even the king's most private moments into public performance. To be admitted to this sacred space was to hold the king's ear, and thus the fate of France. For Jeanne Antoinette, Versailles was a fortress she could not storm by birthright, but she had been trained all her life for the art of theatre. If the court demanded performance, she would act her role better than any duchess. If Versailles required charm, she would dazzle until envy curdled in silence. And yet, the risk. Versailles devoured outsiders. Many before her had risen swiftly on beauty and wit, only to be discarded, sneered at, remembered as little more than a passing scandal. For a bourgeois woman to enter, to remain, to reign, it was unthinkable. But Versailles itself was shifting. Louis XV, once adored as le bien-aimé, was slipping into shadow. He was weary of his queen, Marie Leczinska, whose piety soothed none of his appetites. He was weary of politics, of ministers, arguing, of France's endless debts and distant wars. He longed for amusement, for beauty, for the intoxication of novelty. Versailles was a prison to him, even as it was the glittering envy of Europe. The king's discontent created a crack in the palace's armour. Through that crack, Jeanne Antoinette would slip. It was at masked balls that the boundary between court and outsider thinned. Concealed behind silken masks, Parisian beauties mingled with noble lords, laughter flowing freer than etiquette allowed. It was here that Jeanne, Antoinette's presence was first felt, a laugh that carried like silver bells, a wit that struck like polished steel. Louis XV noticed her. Behind his mask, the king was no longer monarch but man, and before him was a woman who seemed not merely to please, but to enchant. Yet she knew better than to rush. Versailles was a theatre of patience. She appeared and vanished, left impressions rather than demands, allowed desire to ferment in the king's imagination. It was a game of shadows, and she played it with perfection. Still, her entry into Versailles would not be without scandal. The nobles sneered at her origins, calling her an upstart, a stain upon the court. Pamphlets whispered even before she took her place beside the king crude verses mocking her, bourgeois blood, rumours that she wielded sorcery to ensnare him. But Jeanne Antoinette had been born into prophecy. She wore their scorn as armour, for Versailles was not built upon honour, it was built upon theatre, and in theatre the best actress wins. The courtiers prided themselves on ancestry, on centuries of lineage. Jeanne Antoinette would show them that blood alone was not enough, that wit, charm and strategy could outshine 100 generations of noble birth. Versailles had been designed as a cage for ambition, but she would turn it into her stage, and soon the curtain would rise. Versailles was not only a stage of splendour, it was a crucible of cruelty. The noble families, trapped within its golden cage, honed gossip into a weapon more deadly than any sword. If a lady's gown trailed too long, it was mocked as vulgar. If a duke's bow dipped too deep, whispers accused him of servility. Every mistake was magnified in the mirrors, each flaw reflected endlessly until it consumed its victim. More reputations had died in the salons of Versailles than on any battlefield. To survive here required more than beauty. It demanded calculation, the ability to smile at an enemy while planting a dagger in their back with words wrapped in silk. The courtiers perfected the art of malice disguised as charm. Louis XV saw all of this, yet looked away. He had grown up within these walls, surrounded by flatterers who performed devotion while plotting for their own gain. He no longer trusted easily, no longer found joy in the rituals of majesty. To him, Versailles was both kingdom and prison, its gold unable to mask its rot. The queen offered piety, the ministers offered burdens, the nobles offered false adoration. He longed, desperately, for something else, something that felt alive. It was into this atmosphere of weariness and venom that Jeanne Antoinette would soon step. To the king, she would not appear as an intruder, but as a revelation, a spark in a palace grown stale. To the court, she would be a threat to centuries of hierarchy, a dangerous reminder that wit and charm could upend birthright. Versailles was waiting for its next actress, and Jeanne Antoinette, rehearsed all her life, was ready to play the part of a lifetime. The crown of France gleamed, but it pressed like lead upon the brow of Louis XV. Once, as a boy, he had been adored by his people, hailed as Le Bien-Aimé, the beloved. Crowds had cheered his name, mothers had lifted their children to glimpse him as though to receive a blessing. The kingdom had dreamed of a golden age under his reign, but the years, like slow poison, drained that promise away. By the 1,740 Louis XV was a man of contradictions, handsome, elegant, capable of charm that could melt the frostiest of hearts, yet hollowed by boredom. The rituals of kingship, once glittering, had become a cage. Ministers pressed endless documents into his hands, wars that bled treasure, treaties that promised little, finances that spiraled into ruin. The people, who had once adored him, now grumbled under the weight of taxes. He withdrew from them, retreating behind the gilded walls of Versailles, where adoration still flickered but never warmed. The queen, Marie Leczinska, offered him dutiful devotion but no fire. Their marriage, forged for politics, had once been tender but had long since dulled into habit. She prayed, embroidered, raised their many children, but she could not soothe the storm of dissatisfaction within him. Her piety bored him, her silences stifled him. At her side he felt the weight of duty, never the intoxication of desire, so he turned away. Hunting consumed him, the thunder of hooves, the sting of cold wind across his face, the chase of the stag through the woods. Here, at least, he could feel alive. His body awakened in ways the throne never allowed. Yet even the hunt could not fill the void for long. And then there were pleasures of the flesh. Versailles, for all its rituals of piety, was also a palace of sin. Mistresses came and went, their names etched in scandalous pamphlets that circulated through Paris like wildfire. Some were noble women seeking power, others actresses drawn by the promise of diamonds and titles. All burned brightly for a time, then vanished discarded when their beauty paled or their intrigues soured. Louis XV consumed them, as a man drinks wine, eagerly, thirstily, but never satisfied. Each left him emptier than before. The court whispered that his hunger was insatiable, that no woman could ever fill the void within him. It was in this state, weary of duty, jaded by lovers, suffocated by routine, that the king's eyes fell upon Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. The masked ball glowed with candlelight, the air thick with perfume and laughter. Faces were hidden behind satin masks, anonymity giving license to boldness. Music swelled, violins piercing the night as silks rustled across polished floors. She appeared as though conjured from prophecy. Her mask glittered with jewels, Her gown shimmered with pale rose hues that caught the light like dawn itself. She laughed not the hollow titter of court ladies, but laughter that rang clear and silver, alive with warmth. She danced with elegance, but her every movement seemed unstudied, natural, as though joy itself guided her steps. Louis watched, first with curiosity, then with something closer to hunger. He was surrounded always by women who bowed too deeply, who rehearsed every smile. This one seemed to radiate ease, confidence, vitality. Even behind the mask, her eyes caught his, holding them with quiet defiance. She did not look away. The king was intrigued. Whispers spread quickly. Who is she? The courtiers, already sharpening their tongues, murmured of Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, wife of Charles Guillaume de Thiault, daughter of a financier. A woman whispered to have been destined for greatness since childhood. A bourgeois, a scandal. Louis did not care. He sought her out. Their conversation was said to have sparkled with wit. She dared to speak not as subject to sovereign, but as woman to man. She teased, she charmed, she made him laugh in a way few ever dared. Where others flattered, she conversed. Where others trembled, she stood serene. And Louis, weary of sycophants, found himself enchanted. But Jeanne-Antoinette was no fool. She knew a mistress could rise swiftly in Versailles, but fall faster still. To capture the king was not enough, she must hold him. Beauty alone would not suffice. She must offer him something deeper, companionship, counsel, the illusion of being understood. In her eyes, the prophecy whispered again. She was fulfilling destiny. She was stepping into the role rehearsed since childhood, yet danger hung thick in the air, for the courtiers watched with narrowed eyes. A bourgeois mistress? An insult to noble blood. The queen, silent but not blind, observed the growing spark. Ministers muttered darkly of scandal, pamphleteers sharpened their pens. To love the king was to step into a battlefield of whispers and knives. But Jeanne-Antoinette walked toward that battlefield with steady grace. Louis XV, once called the Beloved, believed he had found delight at last. She would be more than a mistress, though the court did not yet know it. She would become the architect of his pleasures, his confidant, his adviser. And Versailles, that glittering theatre of masks, would never be the same. The scandal began not with a whisper, but with thunder. Within months of their first encounters, Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson was no longer a masked enchantress drifting through the shadows of a ball. She was installed in the gilded heart of Versailles itself, mistress of the King of France. It was not enough for Louis XV to invite her into his bed. He gave her a title, a name with which to face the sneering court. Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, daughter of a financier, wife of a bourgeois gentleman, was remade as the Marquise de Pompadour. Land, wealth, jewels, he bestowed them upon her as though gifts could armor her against hatred. But titles purchased with coin and affection did not silence the aristocracy. They hissed behind fans, their lips curling in contempt. Versailles had always known mistresses, duchesses, princesses, ladies of old lineage. But a bourgeoise? A woman whose father's hands had touched ledgers instead of swords? To them, it was an abomination, a humiliation of their order, and yet she endured. Jeanne-Antoinette did not cower in the shadows of Versailles. She emerged into its light, dazzling not only with beauty but with wit. She, dressed with perfection, her gowns a symphony of silks and colours that echoed the Rococo dream of elegance. She walked with the calm poise of one who belonged, refusing to bow lower than etiquette required. She learned the steps of Versailles' endless rituals with unnerving precision, never stumbling, never allowing the old nobility the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The king adored her. His eyes softened in her presence, his lips curved with rare laughter. He called her his petite reine, his little queen. And though Marie Leschinska still held the official crown, all Versailles knew the truth. It was Pompadour who ruled his heart, but she sought more than affection. She had been raised not only on prophecy but on ambition. To remain at Versailles she could not be merely beautiful, she had to make herself indispensable. And so she cultivated not just the king, but the court. She hosted salons within the palace, evenings where music and conversation flowed like wine. Philosophers, poets, and artists gathered at her invitation, and soon the most brilliant minds of France found themselves whispering gratitude for her patronage. Voltaire himself, sharp-tongued and dangerous, was drawn into her circle, praising her intelligence. Painters and sculptors flocked to her, their works filling Versailles with new life. The nobles, who had sneered at her bourgeois origins, found themselves silenced by her mastery of their own weapons. Taste, elegance, charm. She dazzled in the theatre, performing in private plays for the king and courtiers, her stage presence commanding as though she were born to it. She supported artisans, elevating porcelain from Sèvres into a treasure coveted across Europe. She transformed herself from mistress into muse, until Versailles glittered in the image of her vision. But still the daggers glinted in the shadows. The Duchesse de Châteauroux, the king's previous mistress, had been of noble blood. Her allies seethed at being replaced by a financier's daughter. Ministers muttered that Pompadour meddled in affairs beyond her place. Satirical pamphlets circulated through Paris crude sketches, depicting her as a harlot perched upon the king's lap, draining the treasury through her painted lips. In the streets, where bread was scarce, she was cursed as the cause of hunger, as though her silks alone consumed the nation's wheat. She endured it all with serenity. If pamphlets accused her of witchcraft, she smiled as though flattered. If nobles turned their backs, she curtsied with impeccable grace. Her weapon was composure, her refusal to reveal pain. Versailles thrived on humiliation, but Pompadour denied it the feast, and behind that calm mask she manoeuvred. She placed allies in key positions, rewarding those who supported her, punishing with silence those who opposed. She learned the intricacies of foreign policy, advising Louis on alliances and treaties. Ministers who had dismissed her as a frivolous ornament found themselves undone by her influence. Slowly, imperceptibly, she became not only the king's lover, but his confidant, his advisor, the voice he trusted when the voices of ministers clashed. All the while, she kept her balance with the queen. Marie Leczinska, quiet and pious, might have despised her. Instead, Pompadour approached her with deference and kindness. She attended her, flattered her, offered friendship where rivalry was expected. The queen, weary and resigned, accepted her presence with surprising grace. Unlike mistresses who had flaunted their triumph, Pompadour did not seek to humiliate, she sought to endure, and so the scandal hardened into permanence. By the late 1742, it was no longer a question of whether Pompadour belonged in Versailles. She had remade Versailles in her image. The Rococo age blossomed under her patronage, pastel colours, delicate curves, the illusion of effortless grace. France, under her touch, became the cultural centre of Europe. But Versailles was not art alone, it was venom, and the more she rose, the more her enemies plotted. One night, a pamphlet circulated that described her as a puppet master, pulling the king's strings while France collapsed. Another whispered rumour claimed she had bewitched Louis with potions, that her salons were dens of sin. And once, a peasant, convinced she was the cause of France's suffering, attempted to strike her down with a knife as her carriage passed. She escaped unharmed, her composure unshaken, but the court whispered that fate itself had chosen to preserve her. Her power was undeniable, her enemies were relentless. Her position depended not only on the king's affection, but on her ability to outwit a court that longed for her fall. And yet she remained. Jean-Antoinette Poisson, born of bourgeois blood, raised on prophecy, had transformed into Madame de Pompadour, mistress, advisor, patroness, and the most dangerous woman in France. She had conquered Versailles, but Versailles, like a serpent, coils patiently, waiting for its chance to strike. The Queen of France lived in silence. Marie Leczinska, daughter of a dethroned king of Poland, had once been chosen as Louis XV's bride for her meekness, her piety, her utter lack of threat to the kingdom's balance of power. She had arrived at Versailles as a girl of 22, plain but dutiful, unprepared for the serpentine world into which she was delivered. At first, she was cherished. She bore the king children 10 in all, though many died young. She prayed, embroidered, fulfilled her role as consort without complaint. But Versailles was not built to honour silence. It devoured women who could not dazzle, who could not intoxicate. As years passed, the queen aged into obscurity. Louis XV's eyes, hungry for delight, drifted elsewhere. Her role diminished to that of mother and figurehead, tolerated but rarely adored. And then came Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson. To most queens, the arrival of a free mistress meant humiliation, a rival flaunting victory in the very corridors of their home. Versailles thrived on such cruelty. Mistresses of the past had mocked, humiliated, paraded their triumph like conquerors. Queens endured in bitterness, forced to bow beneath the weight of scandal. But Pompadour was different. When she entered Versailles, the queen was already a shadow, tolerated by her husband but largely abandoned. Pompadour might have sought to crush her, to flaunt her power. Instead, she did the opposite. She approached the queen with courtesy, deference, even affection. She curtsied deeply in her presence, addressed her with reverence, offered gifts and conversation. She did not try to humiliate, she tried to soothe. The court watched in astonishment. Here was the king's mistress, daring to claim friendship with the queen she displaced. Was it sincerity, or was it strategy? The truth, perhaps, was both. Pompadour understood that to survive, she needed more than the king's favour. Kings were fickle, passions cooled, but if she could weave herself into the fabric of Versailles, into the very household of the queen herself, then she could not be so easily torn away. Her relationship with Marie Leczinska was a shield against the court's daggers. If the queen did not resist her, who could claim she was a usurper? And Marie, weary of humiliation, weary of scandal, weary of being ignored, accepted. Pompadour offered her what few did: respect. They were opposites, these two women bound by one man. The queen was devout, quiet, pious to the point of severity. Pompadour was radiant, witty, filled with a hunger for art, music, and laughter. Yet together they formed an uneasy alliance. Courtiers, scandalized, whispered that the queen was too timid to resist, that Pompadour had bewitched not only the king but his wife. But when one watched them together, there was something more. The queen smiled faintly, rarely, but genuinely in Pompadour's presence. Perhaps she saw in her not merely a rival, but a woman carrying her own burden of survival in Versailles' poisonous halls. Yet not all were convinced. Ministers muttered that Pompadour was weaving herself too deeply into the monarchy, that her kindness to the queen was nothing but calculated artifice. Noble women scorned her as an actress, a courtesan playing at virtue. Pamphlets accused her of mocking the queen behind closed doors, of rehearsing her deference as one rehearses lines on a stage. Still, Pompadour endured. She attended the queen's mass, accompanied her at gatherings, even stood beside her during ceremonies. To the public eye, she presented not the image of a usurper, but of a companion. Where other mistresses had divided Versailles, Pompadour stitched it together with careful diplomacy. Yet beneath this calm surface, tension lingered. For the queen could not forget that each night, while she prayed alone, Louis XV was laughing in Pompadour's arms. She endured it with grace, but grace is not immunity. There were nights, surely, when tears stained her prayers, when silence weighed heavier than words. And Pompadour, was she sincere in her affection for the queen, or did she simply understand that power demanded masks upon masks? No letter, no diary reveals the full truth. Historians debate whether their friendship was genuine or staged, but Versailles was theatre, and in theatre, what mattered was not truth but performance. In this performance, Pompadour excelled. She positioned herself not as rival to the queen but as her ally, her lady-in-waiting elevated by affection. She softened her enemies by softening the woman they expected her to destroy. And thus, her place at Versailles grew secure. The nobles gnashed their teeth. They had hoped for a catfight, for scandal and bitterness to consume the mistress. Instead, they found themselves silenced by an alliance they could not pierce. The queen, by accepting Pompadour, robbed them of their most powerful weapon. But survival at Versailles was never final. Even as she built her alliance with Marie Leczinska, Pompadour knew others sharpened their knives. Each day was a victory, but each day also carried the risk of ruin. For she had not only captured the king's heart, she had begun to capture his mind. And that, to the courtiers, was far more dangerous than beauty. The courtiers had expected her to fade. Mistresses had always glittered in Versailles, dazzling, extravagant, intoxicating. But they burned out quickly, discarded once the king's passion cooled. They left behind jewels, debts, perhaps a bastard child or two, and a name whispered with scorn. That was the natural order, the rhythm of scandal. Yet Madame de Pompadour did not fade. She remained. At first, the nobles muttered that Louis XV's fascination would surely pass, that this bourgeois enchantress would be gone within the year. But when passion dulled, she did not vanish. she reinvented. From lover, she became confidante. From confidante, advisor. Soon, she was more than mistress. She was the king's most trusted voice. It began in small gestures. When the king sighed in frustration over ministerial disputes, she listened. When his eyes glazed over during councils, she whispered clarity. She learned to anticipate his moods, to soften his tempers, to lift his spirits when melancholy threatened to consume him. He found in her not just beauty, but companionship, someone who did not burden him with demands, who understood his weariness. Slowly, imperceptibly, she became part of his governance. Pompadour began to recommend appointments, to whisper names of men loyal not only to the crown but to her. She wrote letters, advised on policies, soothed quarrels between ministers. She framed herself not as rival to the state but as its helper, presenting advice as comfort, as if she merely lightened the king's burdens. But the effect was undeniable. France itself was being steered by a woman with no official title, no noble birth, only the king's ear. The court trembled. Nobles sneered that a courtesan now ruled France. Pamphlets called her the minister in petticoats. Ministers ground their teeth as their petitions required her approval. Diplomats whispered that the fate of Europe could be swayed not in council chambers, but in the gilded boudoir of Versailles. And still, she smiled. Her influence reached far beyond politics. She became the beating heart of France's cultural life. She championed Voltaire, shielding him when his sharp tongue angered the church. She promoted the Rococo style, with its delicate curves and playful elegance, filling Versailles with pastel silks, porcelain figurines, and gilded carvings. She elevated artisans, the porcelain of Sèvres, the works of Boucher, the engravings of engravers and sculptors who immortalized her image. Through her, France became the envy of Europe, not only for its power, but for its taste. Louis XV delighted in this transformation. She amused him when he was weary, advised him when he was uncertain, charmed him when he was melancholy. He, who had once grown bored of every mistress, found himself unable to imagine life without her. But the price of power was venom. Whispers darkened into accusations. Satirical pamphlets portrayed her as a witch, enchanting the king with spells. Caricatures showed her pulling his strings, France collapsing while she feasted. In Paris, where hunger gnawed, she was cursed as the reason for their suffering, as though every famine, every war, every debt were caused by her painted smile. Even within Versailles, knives were sharpened. Ministers who despised her influence conspired to remove her. Noblewomen scorned her, their resentment sharpened by envy. Some plotted scandals, others whispered rumours of infidelity. But Pompadour endured. Her armour was composure. She smiled at her enemies, bowed when mocked, laughed when accused. To yield to anger would be to reveal weakness, and weakness was fatal in Versailles. Still, not all despised her. Many courtiers were drawn to her salons where wit and art flourished. Artists adored her patronage. Philosophers praised her intellect. To them, she was not merely a mistress but a muse, a beacon of culture in a court otherwise rotting with decadence. Yet even her brilliance could not silence the question that haunted Versailles. How much power was too much? France stumbled through wars and debts. Ministers came and went, but Pompadour remained. Every failure was laid at her feet. If an army lost a battle, it was whispered that she had advised the strategy. If famine struck, it was said she had squandered the treasury on silks and porcelain. If taxes rose, she was mocked as the leech who bled the people dry. The truth was far more complex. She was no omnipotent puppeteer. Her influence waxed and waned, limited by the king's own whims and the endless intrigues of ministers. Yet perception mattered more than truth, and perception declared that Madame de Pompadour was the secret ruler of France. Did she believe it herself? Did she, standing before her mirrors, adorned in jewels, whisper that she had conquered Versailles, that she held in her hands not just the king, but the fate of a nation? Or did she lie awake in her chamber, listening to the echoes of her enemies, wondering when the tide would turn against her? History cannot say, but what is certain is that she endured where others fell. She survived assassination attempts, conspiracies, and the endless scorn of nobles. She endured illness, fatigue, and the king's wandering eye. Each time fate struck against her, she rose again, smiling as though nothing could pierce her armour. and in that resilience she became something more than mistress. She became legend. For Versailles, that golden serpent had devoured countless women, but Madame de Pompadour remained mistress, not only of the king's desire, but of his mind, his soul, and, through him, the kingdom of France. Versailles glittered, but its mirrors reflected more than beauty. Behind every polished pane lurked venom. The chandeliers burned with brilliance, yet in the shadows beneath them conspiracies took root. This was not a court of loyalty, it was a battlefield disguised in silk. And at its centre, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson Madame de Pompadour stood like a queen without a crown, adored by the king, yet despised by almost everyone else. Her enemies were legion. There were the noble women, humiliated that a bourgeois intruder occupied the throne of desire that once belonged to duchesses. They hissed behind their fans, their painted smiles concealing fury. There were ministers, resentful that their policies required her blessing, that their careers rose or fell on the whims of a courtesan. There were priests, thundering that she was sin incarnate, that France's misfortunes were God's punishment for her reign. And there were pamphleteers, faceless, venomous, who poured filth onto parchment and set it loose in Paris, where the starving devoured scandal as hungrily as bread. The libels, those poisonous underground tracts, were daggers aimed at her reputation. They accused her of draining the treasury to buy jewels, of consorting with demons, of corrupting the king with perversions too vile to name. They painted her as a succubus, a harlot, a witch. In one, she was depicted as a serpent coiled around the king, strangling him while France collapsed. In another, as a puppet master, the monarch dangling from her jewelled fingers. And yet, the more they attacked, the more she endured. Her composure was legend. When pamphlets reached Versailles, she did not flinch. She read them, sometimes even aloud, laughing at the grotesque caricatures of herself. "See," she would murmur, "they must think me a goddess, to imagine I hold such power." Her enemies seethed, denied the satisfaction of seeing. Her wounded. But pamphlets were not the only weapons. There were plots, whispered alliances forged in salons lit by candlelight. Ministers conspired to drive her from court, urging the king to cast her aside before scandal devoured his reign. Noble families plotted marriages that might distract him, thrusting their daughters forward like pawns. One plot nearly succeeded. In 1757, a peasant named Robert François d'Amiens struck at the king with a knife, wounding but not killing him. Though the act was not Pompadour's doing, whispers immediately tied her name to the attempt. The assassin, some murmured, had been driven mad by the belief that she bewitched the king. Others suggested she had enemies so powerful they would risk regicide to remove her. Though the truth was tangled, suspicion clung to her like smoke. She responded not with retreat but with greater closeness to Louis. She soothed his fears, consoled him through paranoia, and strengthened her grip. The more others tried to sever their bond, the more tightly she wove herself into his life. Yet Versailles was relentless. Each day was war not with swords but with glances, with murmurs, with poisoned words. At suppers, she felt the eyes of noble women burning holes in her gown. At ceremonies, she heard the faintest coughs of derision when she passed. Even the servants joined in, their gossip flowing through hidden corridors like a dark river. Still, she endured, and not merely endured, she triumphed. For Pompadour had learned a truth Versailles tried desperately to conceal. Power was not in blood, nor in titles, but in perception. She made herself indispensable to the king, and thus untouchable. Ministers might rage, noble women might sneer, pamphleteers might spit venom, but as long as Louis XV adored her, she remained. She fought with intelligence, with patience, with art. She rewarded allies with patronage, silenced rivals with elegance. She filled Versailles with music and theatre, with beauty so dazzling it blinded even her enemies. She turned gossip into a performance, enduring mockery with such serenity that mockery lost its bite. And so the war of intrigues raged on. Each attack seemed to strengthen her, as though prophecy itself protected her from ruin. She became, in the eyes of both friends and foes, indestructible. But indestructible she was not. Every pamphlet, every sneer, every plot left its mark. Behind her mask of serenity, fatigue gnawed at her. Illness crept into her body, the first whispers of the disease that would one day consume her. Yet she refused to show weakness. Versailles was a stage, and the actress must never falter. For the moment she still reigned. The king still leaned upon her, still trusted her more than any minister. She had survived the knives of gossip, the pens of pamphleteers, the conspiracies of courtiers. She had turned survival into art, intrigue into triumph. But Versailles never forgets, and Versailles never forgives. The war was not over, it would only grow darker. Versailles was beautiful by day, but it was cruelest by night. When the candles burned low and the mirrors reflected more shadow than light, whispers carried like ghosts through the corridors. Footmen, maids, pages, all became messengers of rumour. A careless phrase dropped in a salon was repeated in a chambermaid's ear, retold in the kitchens, twisted in the stables, and by morning it had spread across the palace like smoke. By the time it reached the king, it was venom sharpened to a dagger's edge, and almost always the dagger was aimed at Madame de Pompadour. Her enemies were tireless. Ministers resented her interference. Noble families longed to see her disgraced. They tried scandal, ridicule, even piety. The priests thundered from pulpits. France suffers famine because the king sins with his mistress. They spoke of her as a Jezebel, a Delilah luring Samson to ruin. Outside the palace gates, the hungry and desperate echoed their repas. Words. Children starved, while the mistress of Versailles feasted on sugared almonds and cream. It did not matter that Pompadour supported hospitals, that she patronized charities, that she encouraged reforms. The truth was irrelevant. Perception was everything. And perception painted her as the golden leech, feeding on the lifeblood of France. The pamphlets grew crueler. One, illustrated with obscene caricatures, showed her leading Louis by a leash, his crown slipping from his head. Another depicted her sprawled across the treasury, coins spilling into her lap while skeletal peasants begged at her feet. In yet another, she appeared as a sorceress, stirring a cauldron filled with France's fortunes. These libels were cheap, filthy things, printed in secret presses in Paris cellars, yet they were read more eagerly than the finest works of philosophy. People craved scandal, and Pompadour's name was poison they could not resist. Sometimes the king shielded her from these tracks. He would intercept them, burn them, pretend they never existed, but often they reached her hands. She would laugh, turning pages with delicate fingers, as though reading comedies instead of insults. She taught herself to find amusement in hatred. It was the only armour against despair. But she knew each word chipped away at her. Each rumour planted seeds of rebellion. The courtiers attacked from other fronts. They tried to seduce the king with new beauties, parading duchesses and debutantes before him. They whispered of her supposed coldness, her fading allure. They staged accidents of intimacy, a noble woman stumbling into his path, a daring smile over supper. But Louis, though restless, always returned to Pompadour. Perhaps it was not passion that bound him anymore, but dependence. She understood his moods, his weariness, his boredom. She soothed him when no one else dared. And Louis XV, who trusted so few, clung to the one who never judged him. But that dependence made her more hated still. In 1750, a new wave of attacks struck her. Ministers accused her of meddling in foreign policy, of guiding alliances that would doom France. They claimed she had persuaded Louis to ally with Austria, a move many saw as betrayal. Every defeat on the battlefield was blamed on her. When soldiers died, pamphlets declared it was not the fault of generals but of a courtesan in silk. She sends our sons to die, one libel spat. While she plays at theatre and porcelain, even death could not silence her enemies. When the Duchesse de Châteauroux, Louis's former mistress, died suddenly in 1744, whispers blamed Pompadour. Poison, they said. Witchcraft. One story claimed she had kept a book of spells, that she summoned demons to preserve her beauty, and yet she endured. She endured the sneers of duchesses who turned their heads when she passed. She endured the sermons that damned her to eternal fire. She endured the laughter that echoed when she performed in her private theatre, courtiers mocking her audacity behind her back. She endured even the attempt on her life, when a mad peasant lunged at her carriage with a knife, screaming that she had bewitched the king. Through it all, she smiled. Her composure became her deadliest weapon. In a court where every flicker of weakness was blood in the water, she offered none. She curtsied to enemies who spat her name. She praised ministers who schemed against her. She spoke with courtesy, with serenity, her eyes never betraying anger. Versailles thrived on spectacle, and Pompadour denied it the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. But behind the mask, fatigue gnawed at her. She was not indestructible. Each rumour left a scar, each insult a wound. Her health began to falter, headaches, fevers, a cough that lingered too long. She disguised it with powder, with rouge, with the brilliance of her gowns, but the shadows grew beneath her eyes. The war of intrigues was endless. It was not fought in battles that ended, but in whispers that never ceased. Every day was survival. Every night she rehearsed new masks. To falter was to fall. And yet, paradoxically, the very hatred that surrounded her made her legend. She became the lightning rod of France, cursed as the cause of every failure, admired as the embodiment of wit and endurance. The pamphlets meant to destroy her immortalized her instead. Her enemies gave her the aura of a sorceress, and in a way, they were right. For who else but a witch could survive in Versailles so long, wielding power not through blood or office, but through sheer will? She did not win every battle. Ministers slipped from her grasp, alliances turned sour, the king's eye wandered, but still she remained. And Versailles, which had devoured countless women before her, ground its teeth in frustration. The serpent had struck again and again, but Pompadour would not die. Not yet. The war of intrigues would follow her to her final breath, but in this moment she stood undefeated, mistress of survival, mistress of perception, mistress, still, of the king. The bed, once her throne, grew cold. By the early 1750 seconds, Louis XV's desire had begun to wander. The king, who had once clung to Madame de Pompadour with the desperation of a drowning man, now turned his gaze elsewhere. It was not unusual. Versailles had seen it countless times. Mistresses burned bright for a few years, then withered into exile as new beauties captured the royal eye. The court prepared itself for Pompadour's fall. Ministers whispered of her imminent dismissal. Noblewomen sharpened their smiles, pamphleteers readied their cruel epitaphs. She would be discarded, they said, like all the others exiled with jewels, mocked in verse, remembered as a curiosity, nothing more. But they underestimated her. For Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, now long established as the Marquise de Pompadour, understood that desire was fleeting. Passion burned out, but companionship endured, and she would not surrender her place. So she transformed. When Louis's eyes turned toward younger flesh, toward actresses plucked from the theatre, toward nameless girls brought secretly into his hidden apartments, Pompadour did not rage. She did not sulk, nor weep, nor humiliate herself with jealousy. Instead, she offered serenity. She became not his lover, but his friend. This was her greatest act, her most astonishing reinvention. Versailles could not fathom it. A mistress whose passion had cooled should vanish, replaced by another. Yet Pompadour remained seated beside the king at supper, whispering in his ear during councils, hosting his entertainments, soothing his melancholy. She attended him as though nothing had changed, as though the transformation from mistress to companion was natural. The courtiers were baffled. "How does she endure?" they hissed. "How does she remain?" They could not comprehend the depth of her strategy, for Pompadour had never relied solely on beauty. She had built her empire on wit, charm, and indispensability. Louis might no longer seek her in his bed, but he still sought her in every other chamber of his life. He confessed to her his weariness, his boredom, his fears. He listened when she spoke of art, of politics, of philosophy. She amused him when the weight of crown and country threatened to crush him. She created diversions, theatrical performances where she acted with grace, salons where wit flowed like wine, entertainments that pierced his melancholy. Others could warm his flesh. Only Pompadour could soothe his soul. And so their bond deepened into something stranger, more enduring than passion. It became devotion, the kind of devotion Versailles could not understand, because it was not rooted in desire but in dependence. Louis XV, a king who trusted few, trusted her absolutely. The scandal only grew. Pamphleteers mocked her as a barren mistress, a faded rose clinging to relevance. They spat that she had become the king's governess, his nurse, his puppet master. Some accused her of arranging the king's secret liaisons herself, ensuring that no rival mistress could threaten her position. Whether this was true or not, the rumours only cemented her legend. She was no longer merely a mistress, she was an institution. The nobles seethed. For them, power was meant to be fleeting, exchanged like favours, dictated by blood and heritage. Yet Pompadour remained untouchable. They could not understand it, could not destroy it. She had transcended the role of mistress, become something Versailles had no language for. But this endurance came at a cost. To remain indispensable, she sacrificed herself. Behind her perfect poise, her body was failing. Illness crept into her lungs, into her bones. She coughed at night, blood speckling her handkerchiefs. She masked the sickness with powder and rouge, with gowns that dazzled the eye, but the shadow of mortality stalked her. Still, she refused to retreat. To leave Versailles, even in sickness, was to admit defeat, and so she smiled through pain, laughed through fevers, performed while her body decayed. Versailles saw only perfection. Only her mirror reflected the truth. Louis XV never abandoned her. When ministers urged him to cast her aside, he refused. When courtiers mocked her endurance, he defended her. His love may have cooled into something platonic, but his devotion burned fiercely. To him, she was irreplaceable. And so, the prophecy endured. The fortune-teller who had whispered to a little girl that she would capture the king's heart had not spoken of lust alone. Pompadour had done more than capture his heart, she had entwined her soul with his. Even when passion died, she remained the one person he could not live without. It was an inversion of the Versailles myth. Mistresses were meant to be fleeting, queens were meant to endure. Yet here, the queen lived in silence, while the mistress endured like marble carved into Waith, the heart of the palace. She had risen above the battlefield of desire into something greater, the power of devotion. The courtiers could not comprehend it. Versailles was built upon the rhythm of scandal. Passion ignited, passion cooled, mistress discarded. That was the natural order. But Pompadour refused the script. She defied the very laws of the palace. In drawing rooms, noble women whispered incredulously, "How does she endure when she is no longer his desire?" They looked to her with a mixture of fascination and horror. She had survived what none of them could have, the death of a king's lust. For in Versailles, beauty was a currency that devalued with time. Yet Pompadour had transmuted it into something far stronger, influence. The pamphleteers sharpened their attacks. If they could not paint her as a seductress, they would brand her a parasite. They sneered that she had become the king's secretary, a glorified clerk who amused him with gossip while draining the treasury. One libel portrayed her as a nurse, spoon-feeding the king while bleeding him with leeches. Another mocked her as the nun of Versailles, a mistress without passion, clinging to her place by tricks of devotion. But their words, however venomous, only revealed their impotence. The truth was undeniable. Pompadour had accomplished the impossible. She had endured past desire. Louis XV himself spoke to his ministers with quiet finality. "I could live without love, but without her, never." It was a confession more powerful than any embrace, for it revealed the depth of his dependence. She was no longer merely the keeper of his pleasures, she was the keeper of his spirit. This transformation reshaped Versailles itself. Mistresses no longer looked inevitable, they looked temporary, shadows that flickered and died, while Pompadour remained as permanent as the gilded walls. She became an anchor in a court where nothing endured. Her enemies could not dislodge her. For her, power no longer resided in her body, but in her bond with the king's soul. Yet, for Pompadour, the price was steep. Each day of endurance demanded greater sacrifice. Her body, weakened by illness, trembled beneath the silks that adorned it. She forced herself to dance in her private theatre, though her lungs burned with fever. She sat through salons, though her strength faltered, her laughter masking fatigue. Each appearance was an act of will, a refusal to let Versailles glimpse her decline, and still, she smiled. Perhaps it was love, perhaps it was ambition, perhaps it was prophecy. Whatever the truth, she endured because she must. To falter was to vanish, and she had come too far from prophecy to palace, from mistress to companion, to let history write her as a failure. In that endurance, she became more than human to those who watched her. To her allies, she was a miracle of resilience. To her enemies, she was a sorceress whose survival defied natural law. To Louis XV, she was indispensable. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The mirrors of Versailles reflected not only courtiers but the soul of an age. And that soul was being reshaped by a woman who, by blood, should never have entered the palace at all. By the 1752nd, Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, Madame de Pompadour, had transcended the role of mistress. She was no longer the king's passion, but his confidante. No longer the subject of fleeting gossip, but the shaper of France's image. If the king ruled his people, Pompadour ruled France's taste. She was, in truth, an architect of beauty. Versailles had always been the theatre of monarchy, but under her influence, it transformed into a stage of art. Where Louis XIV had stamped his reign with grandeur and severity, Pompadour infused it with elegance and charm. The court glittered not only with gold, but with colour, with light, with the delicate curves of Rococo design. It was she who made porcelain the envy of Europe. The manufactory at Sèvres, once struggling, blossomed under her patronage. She promoted it relentlessly, ensuring that the fragile, luminous works adorned Versailles and the tables of nobility. Each delicate cup, each painted vase, bore the mark of her influence, until porcelain itself became synonymous with French refinement. It was she who championed artists like François Boucher, whose soft, sensual paintings captured the spirit of the age. His canvases, filled with mythological nymphs and pastoral idyls, adorned the king's chambers. In their curves and colours, one saw not only Boucher's hand but Pompadour's taste. It was she who drew Voltaire back into favour when his sharp tongue had exiled him. She protected him from the wrath of ministers, encouraged his plays, and ensured his works found an audience. Through her, Enlightenment ideas crept closer to the gilded heart of monarchy, their sparks flickering in candlelit salons. And it was she who staged performances, transforming herself from patroness to actress. In her private theatre at Versailles, she played roles written for her shepherdesses, queens, goddesses, her presence captivating even those who despised her. To see Pompadour on stage was to glimpse a woman who had made her life itself a performance, who had turned destiny into art. But Versailles whispered. For every admirer of her elegance, there was a critic who called it frivolity. Ministers complained that while armies bled and coffers emptied, the king and his mistress played at porcelain and poetry. Pamphleteers mocked her as a spendthrift, draining France to fund her entertainments. France starves while Pompadour sings. One libel spat. Yet her influence was undeniable. Even her enemies were forced to acknowledge that under her, France became the cultural centre of Europe. Diplomats visiting Versailles returned home dazzled, speaking of the elegance, the refinement, the sheer beauty of the court. To be French was to be fashionable, and to be fashionable was to follow Pompadour's lead. It was not only art, it was politics disguised as art. By shaping culture, Pompadour softened power. The king, often weary of governance, found solace in beauty. Through salons and theatres, she distracted him from despair. Through her patronage, she won allies among artists, philosophers, and intellectuals, creating a network of loyalty outside the poisonous circles of nobility. She turned art into armour. Still, she could not silence the whispers entirely. Some accused her of using culture to mask decay, of painting gilded roses over a rotting edifice. France, they said, was crumbling, its finances broken, its armies faltering, its people hungry. What use were porcelain and paintings when the empire itself withered? But Pompadour knew the truth. Culture endures where politics fails. Armies may lose battles, kings may fall, but art lives beyond death. She was building not only a Versailles of her age, but a Versailles of memory, one that would echo long after her own beauty faded, and in that she succeeded. For centuries to come, the Rococo age would bear her name. The delicate curves, the soft colours, the playful elegance, all became synonymous with Pompadour. She was not merely a patroness. She was the embodiment of an era, a woman who bent art itself to her will. Yet the shadow of irony hung heavy. The more she adorned Versailles, the more fragile France itself became. Behind the porcelain and paintings, debts mounted. Behind the laughter of salons, discontent brewed. The philosophers she championed whispered of freedom, of reason, of a world where kings and mistresses held no power. The very enlightenment she nurtured would one day light the fire that consumed Versailles. But in her time, she glittered. Pompadour, the bourgeois girl of prophecy, had become the mistress of taste, the architect of beauty, the muse of France. Versailles bore her imprint like a signature carved in gold, and through her, France became the stage upon which the world gazed in wonder, even as the stage itself trembled with cracks. Her influence on fashion was just as profound as her influence on art. She turned herself into the canvas of Versailles, each gown a statement, each coiffure a declaration. The pastel shades of rococo lilac, pale rose, sky blue became her palette. Jewels were chosen not for weight but for brilliance, reflecting candlelight in 1,000 fractured sparks. Hairstyles grew higher, powdered into architectural marvels. Women copied her every detail, while men sighed that she had transformed femininity into both spectacle and weapon. Even her name became a fashion. Pompadour, a hairstyle carried it. A shade of rose porcelain bore it. To wear what Pompadour wore, to sip from porcelain she had touched, was to borrow a fragment of her glamour. She had turned herself into an emblem, and the court followed as if bewitched. But beneath the silks and lace, shadows lengthened. The nobility seethed at her dominance over taste. Every new porcelain set, every performance staged, was another reminder that a woman of bourgeois birth had conquered the aesthetic soul of France. To them, she was an impostor, masquerading as patroness. They whispered that her plays were vanity, that her salons were excuses to meddle in politics under the guise of wit. One duchess sneered that Pompadour was a shopkeeper's daughter who plays at being Apollo. Yet even her enemies could not resist what she created. They sneered, but they attended her theatres. They mocked, but they collected Sèvres porcelain. They ridiculed her plays, but they sat in the velvet seats, their eyes fixed on her as she performed. Pompadour was Versailles. To despise her was still to orbit her brilliance. She wielded this paradox with deadly elegance, for she understood what many did not. Kings die, thrones topple, fortunes collapse, but culture lives. It is the one form of immortality humans can create, and so she poured herself into art as though into eternity. Perhaps it was vanity, perhaps it was prophecy, perhaps it was survival, but through porcelain, painting, poetry, and performance, Pompadour built a Versailles that would outlast her, a France that would remain the cultural envy of Europe even as its politics rotted. And in her private moments, when rouge could not hide the fever in her cheeks, when the mirrors revealed the shadow of illness in her eyes, perhaps she understood that art was her armour against decay, that if her body betrayed her, her legacy of beauty would stand in her place. The perfume of Versailles could not mask the stench of blood. While chandeliers blazed and violins played, France's soldiers trudged through mud and snow on distant battlefields. The empire Louis XIV had built through fire and conquest was crumbling under his great-grandson's reign. And though armies marched under banners of kings and generals, many whispered that it was a woman in silks, Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, Marquise de Pompadour, who held the strings. France had never forgiven her bourgeois origins. Now, as war devoured treasure and lives, it found a new crime to lay at her feet, that she was not only mistress of art, but mistress of policy. The War of Austrian Succession had been fought and concluded in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. France gained little, though it had bled much. Soldiers died, coffers drained, yet the map of Europe remained nearly unchanged. A war for nothing, grumbled ministers, a war that gave us shame instead of glory. And in the salons, pamphleteers whispered, Pompadour guided the king's hand. Her enemies claimed she meddled in alliances, that her friendships with philosophers and diplomats shaped treaties more than ministers did. Was it true? History remains divided. But perception is often more powerful than truth, and perception crowned her the hidden minister of France. By the mid-negative 1750 seconds, another storm brewed the 7 Years' War. It would become a global conflict, fought on oceans, in colonies, across Europe itself, and Pompadour, whether by choice or by chance, found her name entwined with its disasters. She supported the diplomatic revolution of 1756, the unlikely alliance between France and its ancient enemy, Austria. For centuries, French kings had fought Habsburgs across Europe. Now, through shifting interests, Austria and France became allies, binding themselves against Britain and Prussia. It was, to many, a betrayal of history, a bewildering turn. Who, they asked, could have persuaded Louis XV to make such a pact? And the answer, whispered with venom, was always the same: Pompadour. Her enemies claimed she had been seduced by flattery from the Empress Maria Theresa, that she had allowed herself to be used as Austria's pawn. Satirists mocked her as a foolish woman swayed by compliments, a courtesan meddling in affairs of empire. When France's armies faltered against Frederick the Great of Prussia, when colonies fell to Britain, the blame was laid at her door. France is ruled not by a king, but by a petticoat, sneered one libelle. And indeed, the disasters mounted. In 1757, France suffered crushing defeats in Germany. In 1759, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham delivered Canada into British hands. The dream of a vast French empire in the New World collapsed in smoke and blood. Colonies in India too were lost. The seas became Britain's dominion, while France's navy lay shattered. The people groaned under taxes, their sons conscripted, their bread scarce. And through it all, Versailles glittered plays, operas, porcelain, powdered wigs, its mistress accused of draining the kingdom's lifeblood. Pompadour bore the blame of a nation's grief. She, who had never commanded an army nor signed a treaty, was cursed as the cause of France's ruin. Ministers, eager to deflect blame, encouraged the whispers. Priests thundered that the disasters were God's punishment for her sins. Pamphlets depicted her as a harlot seated on a globe, crushing France beneath her jeweled feet. And yet, she endured. She continued to advise Louis, to console him when reports of defeat darkened his mood. She told him, after the disaster of Rossbach, "Courage, sire. You are not the first king to lose a battle." It was both comfort and defiance, a reminder that even in failure, monarchy endured. Louis, weary and broken, clung to her still. But the toll was heavy. Each defeat, each loss, carved deeper lines into her face. Each whisper of blame gnawed at her health. She coughed more, tired faster, yet refused to retreat. To leave Versailles was to admit guilt, to surrender to her enemies, and Pompadour would not surrender. She endured because she must. Because prophecy demanded it, because survival had become her art. She endured, even as France itself seemed to crumble. History has never forgiven her. To some, she remains the courtesan who ruined France, whose meddling cost an empire. To others, she is scapegoat, blamed for failures not of her making. Truth and myth entwined, as they always did in Versailles. But in the eyes of her enemies, perception was enough. Madame de Pompadour had not only bewitched the king, she had bewitched France and led it into ruin. The irony was bitter. Versailles glittered brighter than ever, while France's empire crumbled piece by piece. In salons across Paris, candles burned late into the night as pamphleteers and wits dissected each new disaster. The fall of Canada was not a question of strategy or supply lines, it was Pompadour's fault. The losses in India were not the product of Britain's navy, they were Pompadour's vanity. Even the famine that gnawed at the bellies of peasants was laid at her feet, as though her silks alone devoured the nation's grain. Satire became a weapon sharper than steel. Caricatures portrayed her as a gambler playing, with France itself as a courtesan whispering poison into the king's ear. One especially cruel libelle showed her holding a map of Europe in her lap, smearing rouge across it like blood. The implication was clear. Her painted hands stained the world, and yet behind the venom there was fascination, for even her enemies could not deny the audacity of her endurance. Ministers rose and fell, generals were disgraced, territories were lost, but Pompadour remained. To many she seemed less human than elemental, an enchantress untouched by failure. Perhaps that was why they hated her all the more. But if the nation cursed her, Louis XV clung tighter. Defeat aged him, hollowed him, but Pompadour was his constant. She alone could rouse him from melancholy, distract him from despair. When he slumped in silence, she pressed him to theatres, to music, to laughter. When he doubted, she reminded him that kingship was not measured by victories alone. "The people may curse you today, sire," she told him, "but they are fickle. Only glory endures in memory." Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she was trying to believe it herself. For her body was failing. She coughed blood more often now, her fevers leaving her weak. Yet she forced herself into the salons, into the plays, into the king's side. Versailles could never see her broken. She dressed in brilliance, her diamonds sparkling so brightly that no one dared to notice the shadows beneath her eyes. But the war was relentless, and hatred never ceased. Each loss on the battlefield deepened the court's hunger for her ruin. Ministers blamed her to mask their incompetence. Nobles blamed her to mask their impotence. priests blamed her to mask God's silence, and the people, starving, blamed her because her face was easier to damn than a faceless system. Pompadour had made herself indispensable to Louis XV, but in doing so, she had made herself the vessel of all France's anger. The war was not only on distant battlefields, it was at her door. Versailles glittered outwardly, but beneath its chandeliers and gilded ceilings spread an underground plague, a plague of words. Paris, restless and hungry, had become the breeding ground for a new kind of enemy. Not armies, not nobles, but pamphleteers, anonymous writers who struck not with swords but with ink. Their weapons were cheap presses hidden in cellars, their ammunition smuggled sheets of paper. What they produced was venom in prose satire, libel, obscenity, and their favourite target was Madame de Pompadour. The libels, as they were called, spread like wildfire through taverns, salons, and marketplaces. Some were passed hand to hand like contraband treasures. Others read aloud in whispers to those who could not read. They mocked, they slandered, they painted Pompadour not as a woman but as a monster, and once released, they could never be silenced. In their pages, she became a courtesan draining France's lifeblood, a witch brewing potions to enslave the king, a demoness with painted lips red as blood. They accused her of incest, of sorcery, of treachery. One pamphlet claimed she bathed in virgin's blood to preserve her beauty. Another sneered that her very name poisson, fish, revealed her stink, that she had risen from the gutter to spread rot through the kingdom. The satire was merciless, obscene. In grotesque caricatures, she appeared astride the king like a rider on a broken horse. In others, she opened her skirts to reveal not flesh but a treasury, coins spilling out as peasants starved. She was called Madame Deficit, la putaine royale, the royal whore. These were not whispers in dark corners. They were shouted on the streets of Paris, pinned to walls, recited in markets. The more Versailles tried to suppress them, the more they multiplied. Arrests were made, presses confiscated, but another pamphlet always appeared the next day, sharper and crueler than before, and the people devoured them. For, in every word of slander, there was truth to those who starved. Versailles did glitter while they hungered. Pompadour did wear diamonds while they scraped for bread. That she bore blame for wars and debts, for famine and disease, was absurd, but in absurdity they found catharsis. To mock her was to strike at Versailles itself. Versailles, for all its magnificence, could not endure laughter. A kingdom could withstand rebellion, even war, but ridicule corroded its majesty, and ridicule was everywhere. The nobles too took pleasure in these libels. Behind their painted faces and powdered wigs, they read and chuckled in secret. To them, Pompadour was an affront, a bourgeois intruder seated at the king's side. They could not dethrone her, but they could mock her. Each pamphlet was a dagger slipped between her ribs, and still she endured. Pompadour read them, sometimes aloud, her voice steady, even amused. She trained herself to laugh, to pretend their venom could not wound her. "They imagine me all-powerful," she once said lightly, "when I cannot even command the weather." But behind the mask of serenity, the words pierced deep. No diamond could shield her from ridicule. No porcelain mask could conceal the humiliation. The poison pens did more than tarnish her name. They reshaped her legacy. To generations that followed, Pompadour was remembered less for her patronage of art and more for the accusations hurled in these libels. Even centuries later, historians struggle to separate truth from venom, fact from satire. The irony was cruel. She, who had built an empire of taste and elegance, was immortalized not by porcelain or paintings, but by filth printed in shadows. Yet Pompadour, in her own way, turned even this into endurance. If she could not silence her enemies, she would outlast them. She stood at the king's side while pamphlets howled outside the gates. She attended salons while libels depicted her as a monster. She laughed in theatres, while Paris mocked her in rhyme. In the end, it was not victory she sought, but survival. Survival was victory enough, but the war of words never ceased. It followed her into her sick room, into her coffin, into history. Long after her silks rotted, the poison pens still scratched her name into the annals of scandal. And in that, perhaps, her enemies triumphed, for Versailles was a palace of mirrors, and every reflection was distorted. Pompadour's reflection, more than most, was shaped not by truth, but by ink. The war of pamphlets was not waged by poets alone. It was an industry. In the damp, reeking basements of Paris, presses thumped by candlelight, sheets of coarse paper piled up, ink still wet, ready to be smuggled into the streets. Printers risked prison, even death, yet the profits were irresistible, for libels sold faster than bread. The public hungered for scandal more than sustenance, and scandal meant Pompadour. The mechanics of distribution were as intricate as any military campaign. Peddlers slipped folded sheets into coat sleeves. Servants carried them into salons, presenting them as amusements after supper. Students recited them in taverns, their voices thick with drink. By dawn, an entire neighbourhood might be laughing at the newest obscenity, and by nightfall, it would be whispered in Versailles itself. The authorities tried to strangle this underground press. Raids were staged, presses smashed, pamphlets burned in public squares, but for every printer imprisoned, 2 more appeared. The libels were hydra-headed, immortal, mocking the crown's attempts at control, and always, their sharpest venom was reserved for Pompadour. Her enemies within Versailles encouraged them. Ministers who dared not challenge her openly fed rumours into the underground. Noble families, desperate for revenge, bribed pamphleteers to sharpen their knives of ink. Even some within the clergy, outwardly pious, secretly bitter, lent support. It was a war waged in shadows, but its impact was public and devastating. And what made the libels so dangerous was not only their cruelty, but their humour. They made people laugh, and laughter was deadly to monarchy. To fear a king was to obey him. To laugh at him or at his mistress was to strip away majesty. Pompadour, for all her jewels and porcelain, could not withstand mockery. No one could. Some pamphlets attacked her origins. They called her poisson, fish, ridiculing the stench of her name, suggesting that no matter how she perfumed herself, she reeked of the market. Others attacked her sexuality, describing grotesque orgies, imagining her in depravity so absurd that even enemies blushed. Yet the more extreme the claims, the more eagerly they were believed. Still others turned political. They accused her of orchestrating alliances, of selling France to Austria, of gambling with colonies. When armies lost, when ships sank, when taxes rose, the libels claimed it was Pompadour who had willed it. The king, they said, was merely her puppet. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was perception, and perception turned her into a demoness who drained France dry. Yet Pompadour did not retreat. Each morning, she rose, painted her face, donned silks, and stepped into the mirrored halls as though nothing touched her. When libels reached her chamber, she read them aloud, her laughter clear though her eyes burned. She trained herself in composure until composure became her mask, her armour, her survival. Louis XV, who might have dismissed other mistresses under such fire, clung to her all the more. Her endurance impressed him, her serenity soothed him. He admired that she did not break, even when France cursed her name. In her survival, he found stability. And so, despite every libel, she remained at his side. But the toll was immense. No woman could endure such venom without scars. Each pamphlet was a reminder that she would never be forgiven for who she was. Bourgeois, mistress, outsider. Each caricature chipped away at the legacy she tried to build. She had poured herself into art, into culture, into beauty, yet the world remembered filth more readily than porcelain. In private, she confessed her weariness. Letters reveal moments of despair, admissions that the burden of hatred pressed too heavily. Yet in public, she never faltered. Versailles thrived on spectacle, and she gave it perfection. Only her coughing fits, muffled behind embroidered handkerchiefs, betrayed the price she paid. And so the war of pamphlets continued, year after year, an endless reign of venom. But if her enemies hoped to destroy her, they failed. For every libel that mocked her, another portrait by Boucher immortalized her beauty. For every caricature that painted her as a witch, another piece of Sèvres porcelain bore her taste. For every accusation that she ruined France, her salons shone with wit that shaped the Enlightenment. The pamphleteers wrote, "Filth." She built legacy. Both would survive her, entangled forever. In this paradox lay the tragedy of Pompadour. She was both the muse of Rococo elegance and the monster of pamphleteer venom. Her true self, buried between, was lost. Versailles did not care for truth. Paris did not care for truth. Posterity, too, would struggle to find it, and perhaps she knew it. Perhaps, when she looked into her mirrors, and mirrors that reflected her in infinite succession, she saw not only her face, but the distorted faces painted by pamphleteers. Perhaps she understood that she would never control her reflection entirely, but still she stood, still she endured. For Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, Madame de Pompadour, had learned the cruelest truth of Versailles. Survival was the greatest victory, and in surviving, she became immortal, even if immortality was stained with ink. The mirrors of Versailles, once flattering, had become merciless. In them, Madame de Pompadour still appeared radiant, her gowns shimmering in pale pastels, her jewels flashing like captive stars, her coiffures rising in powdered majesty. But beneath the silks and paint, her body was hollowing. The cough that had once been a nuisance now racked her chest with violence. Fever flushed her cheeks, and shadows darkened beneath her eyes. At night, blood stained her handkerchiefs. Tuberculosis was consuming her, yet still she would not leave Versailles. Others in her position, mistresses fallen from desire, mistresses fading into illness, had retreated into the obscurity of country estates, to die quietly among roses or in convent cells. Pompadour refused. She had conquered Versailles, and Versailles would be her stage until the final curtain. So she dressed each morning with care, rouge concealing pallor, powder masking fever. She moved through the mirrored halls as if nothing had changed, her poise unbroken even as her strength faltered. Courtiers watched, some with pity, more with morbid anticipation. They had sharpened their knives for years, waiting for her fall. Now illness was doing what scandal never could. They whispered, "At last, the witch weakens." They smiled, "Soon we shall be rid of her." But she gave them no satisfaction. Even as her lungs failed, she remained the axis around which Versailles turned. She hosted salons, her laughter masking the rattle in her chest. She attended performances, her applause steady even as her hands trembled. She whispered advice to the king, her voice firm though her breath was short. She lived as though illness were nothing more than an inconvenience, as though beauty and will could defy mortality. Louis XV clung to her still. His desire had long cooled into friendship, but devotion bound him. He could not imagine Versailles without her. When courtiers hinted that her decline made her unfit to remain, he silenced them with a look. For all the empire's failures, for all the nation's curses, Pompadour was his anchor. Without her, the hollow king would drift into despair, and so she endured not in triumph, but in defiance. Yet behind the mask, suffering deepened. In her private chambers, away from mirrors, she collapsed into coughing fits that left her gasping. Physicians offered tonics, prayers, leeches, useless remedies. She knew the truth. The disease that had claimed so many would claim her too. She confided to her brother, "I know what awaits me, but I will not give them the pleasure of seeing me fall." The court circled like vultures. Some nobles counted the days, their smiles growing sharper as she weakened. Ministers imagined futures free from her influence. Pamphleteers readied their obituaries, dripping with venom disguised as satire. Versailles, cruel as ever, watched her die as it had watched her live, as spectacle, and still she played her role. One evening she attended a performance in her private theatre. Too weak to act herself, she sat in the shadows, watching others play roles she had once embodied. Her eyes glistened not with envy, but with resignation. Theatre had always been her metaphor for life. Now the play continued without her, and she remained only as audience. Another night, she summoned her closest artists, insisting on discussing commissions she knew she would never see completed. "Beauty endures," she told them softly, "even when we do not." It was both command and confession. By 1764, her decline was undeniable. She could no longer climb Versailles' endless staircases without faltering. She coughed blood openly. The perfume she wore, so heavily roses and ambergris, could not disguise the scent of sickness. Yet still she appeared in the mirrored halls, smiling faintly, her composure more ghostly than regal. Louis XV, perhaps for the first time in his reign, seemed shaken. He visited her chamber more often, his voice softened, his gaze lingering. Though France crumbled under war and debt, though the people cursed his name, in those private moments he was not king but man, and she, not mistress nor minister, but companion. "Stay with me," he whispered once. "I will," she replied, though they both knew the lie. By spring, her body could endure no more. She was confined to her chamber, the curtains drawn against Versailles' cruel sunlight. Courtiers whispered beyond the door. The queen, silent as always, kept her distance. Only a few loyal friends remained, holding her hand when the fever raged, dabbing her lips when she coughed. But Pompadour, even on her deathbed, clung to composure. She dressed to the end, demanding gowns even as her body wasted. She ordered her hair powdered, her cheeks rouged. "I must leave Versailles," she said faintly, as I entered it beautifully. The final weeks were agony, yet she faced them not as victim but as actress, determined to die in costume, with grace. And when death finally approached, Versailles held its breath. The courtiers, who had cursed her for years, gathered in anticipation. The woman they had hated, mocked, ridiculed the bourgeois mistress who had ruled them, was at last departing. Some wept, some smiled, but all watched. For Pompadour had made her life a spectacle, and her death would be no less. She whispered her last words with calm defiance. "I regret nothing." And then, at 42 years old, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, Marquise de Pompadour, mistress of Versailles, I closed her eyes forever. The day Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, Marquise de Pompadour, left Versailles was a day wrapped in rain. The sky itself seemed to mourn, clouds swollen and heavy, their tears soaking the gilded stones. Courtiers pressed their faces to windows, their silks and feathers brilliant against the grey, as the coffin was carried down the marble steps. The air smelled not of perfume but of damp earth and sorrow. For the first time in decades, Versailles felt stripped of spectacle. Pompadour was gone. She had died as she lived, within the mirrored halls, refusing exile, refusing defeat. Now her body, wrapped in velvet and borne by solemn hands, was carried out into the world she had once conquered. Protocol dictated that the king should not watch. Monarchs did not observe funerals, not even of queens, for death was unbecoming of majesty. But Louis XV, breaking centuries of ritual, stood at his window as the rain fell. His eyes followed the coffin as it disappeared down the avenue, and he whispered words that would echo through history. "La marquise n'aura pas beau temps pour son voyage." The marquise will not have good weather for her journey. It was a simple phrase, a human sorrow breaking through the armour of monarchy, and in its quietness lay the truth. For all the scandals, for all the venom, for all the ridicule, Pompadour had been his constant. She was the companion he had never replaced, the confidante whose absence left him hollow. Versailles, however, did not weep. In its gilded corridors, courtiers whispered their relief. For years they had sharpened their tongues against her, praying for her fall. Now fate had done their work. At last, some murmured, "The witch is gone." Ministers exchanged glances, imagining a future unclouded by her influence. Noblewomen smirked behind their fans, their painted lips curling in satisfaction, yet even their triumph was uneasy, for in her absence a silence lingered. Versailles, accustomed to her laughter, her salons, her presence in every chamber, felt suddenly barren. The mirrors reflected only emptiness where once her gowns had shimmered. The stage she had commanded lay vacant, and the court, though jubilant in whispers, trembled in truth. For Pompadour had not been a mere mistress, she had been the rhythm of Versailles. Without her, the palace seemed to falter, its performance disrupted. Paris reacted differently. The people, who had cursed her name, greeted her death with cruel joy. Satirical prints circulated, mocking her coffin, depicting demons dragging her to hell. Libelles declared France free at last from the courtesan who had ruined it. Some celebrated in taverns, raising cups to her demise. Others spat on the ground at the mention of her name. For them, Pompadour's death was justice. But among artists, philosophers, and those she had patronized, grief ran deep. Voltaire wrote with sorrow, calling her a woman of wit and taste, a true friend of the arts. Painters mourned their greatest patroness. The porcelain of Sèvres, the theatre of Versailles, the salons of Paris all bore her absence like a wound. The contradictions were stark. To some, she was a saviour of culture. To others, a siren of ruin. In death, as in life, Pompadour remained a paradox. Her coffin left Versailles beneath the pouring rain, the wheels of the carriage splashing through puddles. No cheering crowds, no solemn processions greeted her. only silence broken by the steady rhythm of rain against wood. The king watched until she vanished from sight, then turned away, his face unreadable. Versailles exhaled. But the silence was not peace. It was the silence of a stage awaiting its next actress, the hush before a new scandal, a new favourite, a new tragedy. For Versailles was never still. It consumed endlessly, mistress after mistress, minister after minister, each leaving traces upon its mirrors before being swallowed by time. Pompadour, however, had left more than traces. She had carved herself into the very soul of the palace. Her salons, her porcelain, her theatres, her laughter, they lingered like perfume long after the bottle was empty. Even in death she haunted Versailles, and Louis XV, though he never spoke of her again in public, carried her absence like a wound. He filled his nights with fleeting pleasures, but none could replace her. His reign would stumble into deeper scandal, deeper ruin, until he died despised, unloved, a hollow shadow of the bien-aimé he once was. But in that moment, as the rain carried her coffin away, all Versailles knew an era had ended. The rain that fell that day was more than weather, it was omen. Courtiers, peering from the safety of their gilded windows, muttered that heaven itself was purging Versailles of Pompadour's spell. Priests, with cruel satisfaction, declared the storm divine justice. The courtesan departs in shame, washed from the earth by God's tears, but others whispered differently. Some said the rain was mourning, that the heavens wept for a woman who had lived with more courage than most men at court. Servants, who had seen her kindness in private, the gifts, the words of encouragement, the coins slipped quietly into desperate hands, bowed their heads in true sorrow. The procession itself was bleak. Unlike queens who departed Versailles with trumpets and masses, Pompadour was carried away without ceremony. The nobility who had tolerated her in life would not honour her in death. Few followed the coffin. No masses were sung in the grand chapels. She slipped from the palace as though she had never belonged there, as though Versailles sought to erase her presence. And yet, erasure was impossible. In the Hall of Mirrors, her reflection still lingered, seen in memory if not in glass. In the salons, her wit echoed like a ghost. The theatres she had built remained, their curtains falling heavily on empty stages. The porcelain she had championed still gleamed, its delicate curves whispering her name. Versailles could not cleanse itself of Pompadour, no matter how it tried. She had woven herself into its very bones. The court, though outwardly jubilant, found itself strangely adrift. Pompadour had been a figure of hatred, yes, but also of order. She had structured the chaos of Versailles with her salons, her entertainments, her diplomacy. Without her, the palace felt rudderless. Even her enemies, in their secret thoughts, admitted that the court seemed somehow smaller without her. Louis XV, meanwhile, bore his grief in silence. He never spoke of her again, never allowed her name to pass his lips, yet his actions betrayed him. In the months after her death, he sank deeper into melancholy, withdrawing from governance, drowning himself in fleeting pleasures. The small apartments he created at Versailles for clandestine liaisons, the Parcours serfs, were born of this void, a desperate attempt to fill what Pompadour's absence had left. None of those women mattered. None were remembered. All were shadows. Outside Versailles, Paris thrummed with cruel celebration. Pamphlets mocked her funeral, portraying demons cavorting around her coffin, dragging her spirit to the underworld. One claimed she had bartered her soul to the devil in exchange for influence, and that now he had come to collect his debt. Street performers sang obscene ballads, their verses rhyming Pompadour with porriture rot. And yet, among the artists she had elevated, grief was profound. Boucher's brush grew darker. Voltaire mourned her as the one who had shielded him from his enemies. Musicians who had played in her salons composed laments in her honour. At Sèvres, artisans wept as they painted, their porcelain no longer destined for her hands. For them, her patronage had been more than vanity, it had been life. The paradox sharpened. To some, her death was liberation. To others, it was loss. To Louis, it was silence. And Versailles itself seemed to sag under the weight of her absence. The palace continued. Of course, courtiers still schemed, ministers still plotted, chandeliers still blazed. But the rhythm Pompadour had imposed was broken. The plays lacked sparkle. The salons grew stale. The court became less theatre, more shadow. She had been the actress who carried the performance, and without her, the play faltered. In death, she had achieved what she had sought in life: to endure, for her absence was felt more strongly than her presence had ever been acknowledged. The rain fell until evening, soaking the earth where her carriage passed. Some said the drops that slid down Versailles' mirrored walls looked like tears, and the palace itself, weeping for the woman who had ruled it without crown or throne. Others said it was cleansing, as though the heavens scrubbed her stain from France. Both could be true, but one truth was certain: Versailles would never be rid of her. The Hall of Mirrors is silent now. The chandeliers still blaze, the gilded walls still glitter, the gardens still stretch like a dream of order carved into earth, but the laughter is gone. No soft voice carries above the music. No powdered figure commands the gaze of all. The mistress who once ruled Versailles has departed, but her reflection lingers still, caught in the endless glass. Madame de Pompadour has never left Versailles. For what is legacy, if not the shadow that clings to mirrors long after the body is gone? To her enemies, she remains the courtesan who bewitched a king, drained a treasury, and led France into ruin. They see her as emblem of decadence, proof that monarchy had rotted into frivolity. When the revolution came, decades later, her ghost was invoked in pamphlets that condemned the extravagance of Versailles. "Remember Pompadour," they cried, "and see how mistresses squandered the kingdom." To others, she is muse and saviour, the patroness who elevated art to brilliance, who transformed porcelain into treasure, who brought Voltaire back into the king's favour, who made Versailles the cultural heart of Europe. Without her, Rococo might have been a whisper. With her, it became the very face of an age. To Louis XV, she was both lover and friend, mistress and minister, actress and anchor. His reign stumbled into shadow after her death, as though he had lost not only a woman but the rhythm of his life. When his coffin left Versailles years later, it was not his queen, nor his ministers, who haunted his memory. It was Pompadour. The truth lies somewhere between myth and venom, between admiration and ridicule. She was not the omnipotent puppet master of pamphlets, nor the flawless angel of artists' portraits. She was a woman ambitious, intelligent, resilient, who played her role upon the most dangerous stage in Europe and survived longer than anyone thought possible. Survival itself was her triumph. For Versailles devoured women. Mistresses came and went, their names burned out in scandal. Yet Pompadour endured for nearly 20 years, reinventing herself when passion faded, wielding wit when beauty was doubted, turning ridicule into armour. She proved that power was not only born of bloodlines, but could be carved by charm and intellect. In an age where birth determined destiny, she bent destiny to her will. And though she died at 42, her spell endures. Even today, her name carries paradox. Fashion still bears her mark: the Pompadour hairstyle, the Pompadour rose, the Pompadour shade of porcelain. Museums hold her portraits, her jewels, her delicate cups and figurines. Voltaire's letters praise her wit. Boucher's paintings immortalize her beauty. The porcelain of Sèvres gleams with her influence. Every artifact whispers the same truth: she is not forgotten. Her myth has outlived the monarchy she served. Versailles itself fell to revolution, its mirrors reflecting the chaos of mobs instead of courtiers. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lost their heads beneath the guillotine. Yet Pompadour endures not as victim but as legend, a mistress who reigned like a queen, a bourgeois girl who bent an empire. Some say she ruined France, others say she saved its soul. Perhaps both are true, perhaps neither. History, like the mirrors of Versailles, distorts, but one cannot deny her mastery of survival. Against nobles who scorned her, ministers who plotted her ruin, pamphleteers who mocked her, priests who damned her, peasants who cursed her, she stood. She endured. She died not. In exile, not forgotten, but in the palace she had conquered, with a king at her side and a nation speaking her name, even if with venom. In that endurance lies her spell. Walk the Hall of Mirrors today, and if you pause, you may feel it still, the faint echo of silk across parquet, the soft laughter drifting through chandeliers, the weight of eyes upon a woman who was not a queen, yet ruled like one. Look closely into the endless glass, and perhaps you will see her reflection, powdered, jewelled, smiling faintly, watching as history still debates her name. Madame de Pompadour, the mistress who ruled a kingdom, the actress who played her role to perfection, the woman who made herself immortal not through love alone but through the art of survival. And survival, in Versailles, was the rarest triumph of all.